Hello, and welcome to Sleeping History. Our journey tonight takes us to the banks of the Nile River, to a civilization that measured its existence not in years, but in millennia. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds usually drift to a few familiar names etched onto monuments of impossible scale. We might picture the Great Pyramid at Giza, a mountain of stone built over 4,500 years ago for a pharaoh named Khufu. We might think of Ramses the Great, who ruled for 66 years during Egypt's Golden Age, the 19th Dynasty, and who built the massive temples at Abu Simbel. We certainly know Tutankhamun, the boy king, not for his short reign, but because his tomb was discovered in 1922, a perfect, glittering time capsule. And of course, we know the last pharaoh, Cleopatra, whose life marked the dramatic end of Egypt's long story. These rulers achieved their goal. They ensured we would remember them. But tonight, we are not looking for the names in the spotlight. We are searching for the shadows. We are looking for the pharaohs who were just as powerful, just as ambitious, but whose successors tried to wipe them from memory entirely. In ancient Egypt, a name, your Ren, was a vital part of your soul. As long as your name was spoken or written, your spirit, your Ka, could live forever in the afterlife. The most terrible punishment, then, was not death. It was erasure. A state-sponsored campaign to find every carving, every statue, and every mention of a pharaoh, and with a chisel, to hack that name and face from existence. This was an attempt to kill a soul. But the erasers were not perfect. They left clues, and tonight we will follow them. If you enjoy these quiet explorations of the past, please consider subscribing to our channel. It allows us to keep digging up these forgotten stories for you. Now, take a deep breath and settle in. We are about to search for the secrets of the forgotten pharaohs. In our last chapter, we spoke of the familiar names of Egypt: Khufu, Ramesses, Tutankhamun. They are the ones who won their gamble against time. But now we must turn our attention to the losers of that gamble, or rather to those who had their place in the game stolen from them. To understand what it meant to be a forgotten pharaoh, we must first understand the act of forgetting. This was not a passive, gentle fading into obscurity. It was an active, deliberate, and violent act. It was an act of political and spiritual war. The Romans, centuries later, would have a name for this: damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. For them, it was a legal decree. After an emperor was overthrown, the Senate might order his statues to be torn down and his name struck from public records. It was an act of political housekeeping. But for the Egyptians, it was something far deeper, far more terrifying. To the Egyptians, to erase a name was not just to erase a legacy. It was to commit a second and final death. It was to destroy a soul. Tonight, we will explore this terrible and precise weapon. We will look at the why, the how, and the profound spiritual stakes of the condemnation of memory. To understand the why, we must first set aside our modern ideas about life and death and try to see the world as an ancient Egyptian did. For us, a name is a label, a word we use to identify ourselves. For an Egyptian, the name, or Ren, was a fundamental, living part of the soul. It was given to you at birth by the gods, and it was as real and as necessary as your heart or your brain. Your Ren, your name, had to live on for you to continue existing in the afterlife. And how did a name live on? It had to be written and it had to be spoken. This is the key. The ancient Egyptians believed in the power of the written and spoken word. Hieroglyphs were not just letters. They were medut neter, or the words of the gods. They were magic. To write 1,000 loaves of bread, 1,000 jugs of beer on a tomb wall was not a wish. It was a magical act. It was believed that the deceased spirit, their Ka, could draw sustenance from those written words for eternity. In the same way, to speak the name of the dead was to make them live. It was to make their name live, and in doing so, you helped to sustain their soul in the great beyond. This is why tombs were not just silent graves. They were spiritual machines. They were covered from floor to ceiling in the name and titles of the deceased. Every statue was an image of them, and almost every one was inscribed with their name. The statues themselves were called Ka statues. They were built to be a physical home for the Ka, the life spirit, to inhabit, a place where it could come to receive the offerings of food, drink, and incense left by living relatives or priests. Now, imagine what this means. If your survival for all eternity depends on your name being written and your image existing, what is the most complete and total way to destroy you? You destroy the name. You find every place it is written, and you take a chisel and you chip it away. You find every statue, every vessel for their Ka, and you smash it. You silence them. You starve them. You make it so no one can ever speak their name again. You kill their soul, and you erase them from the fabric of time in this world and the next. This was the condemnation of memory. It was not mere vandalism. It was a targeted, spiritual assassination. So, how was this terrible act carried out? It was not done in secret, under the cover of night. This was a state-sponsored, systematic, and often decades-long campaign. Imagine a team of official workers sent by the new pharaoh with a simple, brutal task. They would enter the grandest temples in the land, temples built by the very pharaoh they were sent to erase. They would bring scaffolding and ladders, mallets and chisels of hard copper or bronze, and they would begin their work. Their first target was the most important, the cartouche, the oval ring that contained the pharaoh's royal name. It was a symbol of their power, a cosmic seal. The workers would place their chisels against the smooth stone and strike again and again and again. They would hammer away at the delicate hieroglyphs until the pharaoh's name was nothing but a rough, oblong scar in the wall, a blank space where a king used to be. They would chip away at the figures too. If the pharaoh was shown giving offerings to the gods, they would scrape away the pharaoh's body, leaving the god intact, as if receiving an offering from no one. But they were often precise. They were not trying to destroy the temple itself. The temple was holy. They were only trying to destroy the memory. Sometimes, in their haste, they would simply recarve the name of the new pharaoh, like Ramses the Great, directly over the top, a form of identity theft, written in stone. The statues were next. These were the homes of the Ka. To destroy them was to make the spirit homeless. The statues were toppled. They were broken with heavy stones. But the destruction was not random. It was often specific. Archaeologists have found thousands of fragments of royal statues, and they very often notice the same pattern. The statues are smashed, but the faces are targeted with special care. The nose is almost always broken off. For a long time, this was dismissed as the work of later cultures, or simply the part that breaks most easily when a statue falls. But we now understand this was part of the magical destruction. The nose is for breathing. By smashing the nose, the destroyers ensured the Ka inside the statue could no longer breathe. It was an act of suffocation. The mouth would be smashed to prevent the Ka from speaking the magical spells needed to sustain itself. The ears would be chiseled away to prevent the Ka from hearing the prayers of the faithful or the call of its own name. It was a systematic, ritual killing of the statue to ensure it could never again function as a home for the spirit. The broken pieces, now dead, were then often buried in pits within the temple grounds.
Ironically, it is because of this burial that we have many of them. The act of burying them, rather than grinding them to dust, preserved them for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. But the campaign of erasure did not stop there. It had to be total. If a pharaoh had built a great temple, a later ruler might dismantle it, block by block. These used blocks, called talatat, were then taken and used as simple, hidden filler material inside the walls and foundations of a new building. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, whom we will meet later, had his temples at Karnak completely torn down. His successors, like Horemheb and Ramses II, then used his beautifully carved blocks as the internal rubble for their own giant gateways or pylons. They were in effect turning a king's greatest monument into gravel. Finally, there was the ultimate bureaucratic erasure, the official king list. Several times in Egyptian history, a pharaoh would commission a king list, a carving of all the pharaohs who came before, showing a neat, unbroken line of succession all the way back to the gods. This was a piece of propaganda. It was to show that the current pharaoh was the one true, legitimate heir. And on these lists, the condemned pharaohs are simply gone. On the famous king list of Seti I at Abydos, we see a long line of names. But when we get to the 18th dynasty, the list jumps. It goes from Amenhotep III straight to Horemheb. In that single jump, it skips over 4 or 5 rulers. It erases the most radical period in Egyptian history. It erases the heretic Akhenaten. It erases his mysterious successor, Saqqara. It erases Tutankhamun. Yes, even King Tut. Because he was the son of the heretic, he was tainted. He too was condemned to be forgotten. The condemnation of memory was total. It was architectural. It was artistic. It was bureaucratic. And it was spiritual. This brings us to our final and most important question. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why spend decades and vast state resources chiseling away at stone? Our modern minds immediately go to human, personal motives, revenge, hatred, jealousy, a bitter stepson, perhaps, an angry rival. And sometimes that was surely part of the mix. Humans are humans in any century. But for the ancient Egyptians, the motive was almost always something far grander, and in their minds, far more necessary. The core concept of the entire Egyptian civilization was a single word, Maat. It is a word that is difficult to translate. It means truth. It means justice. It means balance, harmony, and the correct, divine order of the universe. Maat was the force that kept the world stable. It was the reason the sun rose every morning, the reason the Nile flooded and brought life to the land, the reason the stars moved in their correct patterns. The pharaoh, the king, had one ultimate job: to uphold Ma'at. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, lies. Now, imagine a pharaoh comes along who, in the eyes of their successors, has broken Ma'at. Perhaps this ruler was a woman who dared to rule as a male king, breaking the divine centuries-old pattern of kingship. Perhaps this ruler was a heretic who tried to destroy the old gods and replace them with a single new one. In the eyes of the pharaonic state, these rulers were not just political problems. They were cosmic problems. Their reigns were not just unconventional. They were an eruption of Isfet, of chaos. They were a stain on the timeline of history. Therefore, to erase them was not an act of petty revenge. It was a vital, pious act of restoring Ma'at. It was cosmic housekeeping. It was a way to heal the timeline, to scrub the stain of chaos from the memory of Egypt, and to ensure that the sun would continue to rise and the Nile would continue to flood. It was their duty to the gods and to the future of the nation to pretend these anomalous rulers had simply never existed. This is why the erasures were often delayed. The condemnation of Hatshepsut, the female king, did not begin the day she died. It began nearly 20 years after her death, when her stepson was an old and established king himself. This was not a hot-blooded act of passion. It was a cold, calculated, and necessary act of state. The condemnation of memory, a weapon forged from chisels and faith, a tool to right a cosmic wrong, a way to kill a soul. It was meant to be the final word, the perfect erasure. But it failed. It failed because the erasers were human. They couldn't find every single statue. They couldn't find every hidden inscription in a dark corner of a private tomb. They smashed statues and buried them in pits where we found them like a divine puzzle. They tore down temples and hid the blocks inside their own walls, creating accidental time capsules for us to find 3,000 years later. But most of all, the erasure failed because the act of erasure is not invisible. It leaves a mark. It leaves a scar, a rough, empty space on a temple wall, a suspicious gap in a king list. These scars are for us a map. They are the clues that tell us, look here, something important was here. Something or someone that they wanted you to forget. The condemnation of memory, in the end, became the very thing that preserved the forgotten. It is the reason we can tell their stories tonight. And it is with the first and perhaps most famous of these scars that we will begin our next chapter. The story of a ruler who built an empire of peace, only to have her name hacked from the stone. The king, Hatshepsut.
In our last chapter, we explored the terrible cosmic weapon of damnatio memoriae. We learned that to erase a name was to kill a soul. We saw the blank spaces, the chiseled-away scars on the temple walls, and we learned that these scars are our map. They are the clues that point us to a story that someone, a powerful someone, wanted to bury. Tonight, we follow the first of those clues. We travel back in time to the height of Egypt's power. We are in the 18th dynasty, a period that began around 1550 BC. This is the New Kingdom. Egypt is rich, powerful, and secure. Its armies have conquered an empire, and gold flows into the treasury from Nubia in the south and from the kingdoms of the Near East. The pharaoh is not just a king. He is a living god, a warrior, the upholder of Ma'at, or divine order. The line of succession is clear. The pharaoh rules, and his son, the heir, waits to take his place. It is into this world of absolute power, of rigid tradition, and of clear-cut roles that a woman was born who would change the story of Egypt, not by breaking the rules, but by rewriting them. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she would become a king. Hatshepsut was not born to rule, not as king anyway. She was born into the most powerful family on earth. Her father was the great warrior pharaoh Thutmose I. She was of pure, royal blood. Her early life followed the traditional, expected, and very powerful path for a royal woman. First, she was a king's daughter. Then, she was given the most important religious title a woman could hold, the god's wife of Amun. This made her the high priestess of the most powerful god in the land, Amun-Ra. It was a role of immense spiritual and political influence. And finally, as was tradition, she was married to her own half-brother, who would become the pharaoh, Thutmose II. This made her the great royal wife, the queen of Egypt. She had reached the very peak of power for a woman. She was respected, she was wealthy, and she was at the center of the court. And for any other woman in Egyptian history, this is where the story would have ended. But fate, and perhaps ambition, intervened. Her husband, Thutmose II, had a short reign. He died, leaving behind only one male heir. This boy, also named Thutmose, was the son of a lesser non-royal wife. And he was a very small child, perhaps only 3 years old. This created a crisis. A child cannot rule Egypt. A child cannot lead armies or perform the complex daily rituals to the gods that kept Ma'at in balance. The solution, however, was a traditional one. The widow of the dead king, the great royal wife, would step in to hold the throne for the boy. She would become his regent. Hatshepsut was now in charge. She was the most powerful person in Egypt, ruling on behalf of her young stepson, Thutmose III. This was normal. This was acceptable. For the first few years of the young boy's reign, everything was done according to the rules. Inscriptions show them together. Thutmose III was the official pharaoh. Hatshepsut was the regent, the power behind the throne. And then, something changed. Around the 7th year of her stepson's reign, Hatshepsut made a move that was so bold, so unprecedented, that it still echoes through history. She did not set aside Thutmose III. She did not depose him. Instead, she joined him. She declared herself a pharaoh, a co-ruler. She took a royal name. She had herself crowned as king of Upper and Lower Egypt. From that day forward, Egypt had 2 pharaohs, the young boy, Thutmose III, and his aunt, the king Hatshepsut. This was not a regency. This was a co-regency, and she was, without question, the senior partner. This was the great, unprecedented act. A woman had never, in the 1500-year history of Egypt, successfully and fully claimed the title of pharaoh. A few women had briefly held power at the end of a dynasty, during times of chaos. But this was different. This was the 18th dynasty, at its golden peak. and she was claiming the throne by right. But how? How could she justify it? In a world run by tradition, how could she justify breaking the greatest tradition of all, that the king was a man? She did it with a story, a brilliant piece of propaganda, carved for all to see on the walls of her greatest temple. She claimed that her birth was not normal. She told the story in stone that her father was not Thutmose I. Her true father, she said, was the king of the gods himself, Amun-Ra. The reliefs on her temple tell the story like a comic book. They show the god Amun taking the form of her father, Thutmose I. He enters the queen's chambers and reveals his divine self. He announces that she will bear a child, and that this child's name will be Hatshepsut. He declares she is to exercise the splendid kingship in this entire land. This was a political masterstroke. Other pharaohs had called themselves son of Amun, but Hatshepsut was claiming something more. She was saying she was Amun's chosen daughter, selected from birth by the god himself to rule. She was not taking the throne, she was accepting the destiny the gods had given her. Who could argue with the king of the gods? With her divine right established, she now faced a second problem: the image of kingship. For 1,500 years, the office of pharaoh was, by definition, male. All the symbols, all the costumes, all the statues depicted a male body. The word pharaoh was tied to the idea of the strong bull, the male warrior, the husband of the land. There was no template for a female king. The language, the art, and the religion had no place for one. So Hatshepsut made another brilliant, and for us, a very curious decision. She did not try to change the office. She changed herself. If the office of king was male, then she would be depicted as male.
If you look at the art from her reign, you can see the change happening. In the early years, she is shown as a woman, but wearing the king's crowns. But soon, the transformation is complete. In her statues, she has the body of an idealized male king, a broad, bare chest, muscled arms. She wears the shendit, the male kilt. She wears the royal nemes headdress, and on her chin, she wears the false beard. The beard was not a symbol of being a man, it was a symbol of being a god. And the king was a living god, so she wore it. This was not, we must understand, cross-dressing. She was not trying to be a man in her daily life. We have no reason to think she wore these things at breakfast. This was iconography. This was the official, state-sanctioned uniform of the job. The job was king, and this was what a king looked like. In her inscriptions, the problem of language is even more fascinating. The scribes seem to be confused. Sometimes they refer to her as His Majesty, using the male pronoun. Other times, they seem to compromise, writing things like His Majesty, the King, she. They used the male titles, but the female grammar. She was, in every sense, a king. And what did she do with this power? While the male pharaohs before and after her, including her own father, would define their reigns by war and conquest, Hatshepsut would define hers by peace, prosperity, and building.
She was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history. She built at Karnak Temple, the religious heart of the kingdom. She raised two massive, 100-foot-tall obelisks of red granite. They were carved in a single piece, floated hundreds of miles down the Nile, and raised in a feat of engineering that still baffles us. But her masterpiece, her true legacy, was her mortuary temple, a building so beautiful, so modern, that it still takes the breath away. She called it Dejer Dejeru, the holiest of holies. We know it today as Der el-Bahiri. It is not a dark, massive fortress like other temples. It is a light, airy, three-tiered structure that seems to grow out of the cliffs behind it. It is a masterpiece of harmony, of pillars and ramps, of open-air terraces. And it was on these walls that she told her story, her divine birth, her coronation, and the greatest achievement of her reign. This great achievement was not a war. It was an expedition. Sometime around the 9th year of her reign, Hatshepsut ordered a great trading expedition to a far-off, almost mythical land. She called it the Land of Punt. We are still not 100% sure where Punt was, but it was likely somewhere on the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. To the Egyptians, it was a land of wonders, the land of the gods. The reliefs on her temple show the entire journey. We see her ships, dismantled, being carried over land to the Red Sea, where they were reassembled. We see them sailing south to a strange new land. We see the people of Punt, who lived in beehive-shaped houses on stilts. We see the chief of Punt and his wife, depicted with a realism that is startling for Egyptian art. And we see the triumph of the mission. The Egyptians are not conquerors. They are traders. They come back with the treasures of Punt, piles of gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals like leopards and monkeys. But most important of all, they bring back myrrh. They bring back so much myrrh, the fragrant incense, that they are able to fill the temple storerooms. And in an act of incredible piety and a master class in public relations, they bring back living myrrh trees, their roots carefully bundled in baskets. These were the first time, we think, that trees were successfully transplanted from one nation to another. They planted them on the terraces of her temple, Dejer Dejeru, so it could be a garden for her father Amun. This expedition was her signature achievement. It was a statement. It was her saying, "I do not need to bring back prisoners of war to show my power. I can bring back the treasures of the gods. I bring you peace. I bring you prosperity. I am the true upholder of Maat." For 22 years, Hatshepsut ruled as king. She was, by every measure, a success. She kept the borders secure. She made the country wealthy. She built monuments that would be the envy of the world. She fulfilled her duty to the gods. And all this time, what of the other king, the stepson, Thutmose III? The popular myth, the one we see in movies, is that of a wicked stepmother who stole the throne from a young, resentful heir who was locked away, biding his time. The history, the facts, tell a very different and far more complicated story. Thutmose III was not locked away. As he grew, he was given the role he was born for, a soldier. He was made the head of Hatshepsut's armies. While she ruled from the palace, he was on the frontiers, learning the craft of war, leading his troops. He was, in effect, in an apprenticeship. Their names appeared together on monuments. She was the senior king, he was the junior king. For 22 years, this unusual arrangement worked. And then, around 1458 BC, after a long and prosperous reign, King Hatshepsut died. She was buried as a pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb she had prepared for herself. Her co-ruler, Thutmose III, the boy she had been regent for, now became the sole pharaoh of Egypt. He was a man in his prime, a trained general, and he was finally, completely in charge. And it is here that the quiet of Hatshepsut's story ends, and the violence of her memory begins. Her great works stood for nearly 2 decades after her death. Her name was spoken, her spirit was fed, and then the chisels came out. But why? Why, after 20 years, did her successor begin the Great Erasure? Was it personal hatred, or was it something else?
In our last chapter, we left King Hatshepsut at the end of her life. She died around 1458 BCE after a remarkable and peaceful reign of 22 years. She had built great temples, sent expeditions to the fabled land of Punt, and enriched her nation. She had successfully broken every tradition by ruling not as a queen, but as a male pharaoh, a king. She was buried with the full honors of a pharaoh in her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and her stepson, Thutmose III, the man who had been the junior king in her shadow for 2 decades, was now, at last, the sole ruler of Egypt. And here is where the story, as we often hear it, begins. The popular myth is one of drama. It's a story we understand, a human story. We picture Thutmose III, filled with decades of resentment, a man who had his throne stolen, forced to serve the woman who was not his mother, but his aunt and stepmother. We imagine that on the day of her funeral, the chisels came out. We picture a whirlwind of destruction, a furious, vengeful pharaoh finally unbound, tearing down her statues and hacking her name from every wall in a fit of passionate, personal rage. It is a good story, but it is not what happened. The truth, as recorded in the stone, is far stranger, far quieter, and far more complex. It tells us that for years, nothing happened. Upon becoming the sole pharaoh, Thutmose III did not look backward. He did not seem to be consumed by the past. Instead, he looked outward. He exploded onto the world stage. He took the army that Hatshepsut had maintained, but rarely used, and he used it. He led his first great military campaign, marching his forces into the Near East. At the Great Battle of Megiddo, he led his men in a brilliant, daring charge, and he won a victory that would secure Egypt's empire for generations. He would go on to lead at least 17 military campaigns. He would become the most celebrated warrior pharaoh in all of Egyptian history. Historians, centuries later, would call him the Napoleon of Egypt. He was busy. He was building his own empire, his own legacy. He was carving his own name,
the name of Thutmose III on temple walls from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. And all this time Hatshepsut's name remained. Her great obelisks at Karnak still pierced the sky. Her magnificent temple, Dejeru, still received offerings. Priests still spoke her name in the Bailey rituals. In fact, there is evidence that Thutmose III completed some of her projects. He didn't tear them down, he added to them. This was not the act of a man blinded by hatred. The years stretched into a decade, then 2 decades. Thutmose III was no longer the young man who lived in his stepmother's shadow. He was an old, respected, and all-powerful emperor. And then, after nearly 20 years of sole rule, the order was given. The great erasure of Hatshepsut began. This is the most important clue in the entire mystery, the delay. This was not a hot-blooded crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated, and deliberate act of state policy. It was conceived by an old king, not a young, angry one. Now imagine the scene. We are at her beautiful temple, Deir el-Bakhri. It is a normal day. But then a royal workers arrives. They are not a mob, they are officials. They are carrying scaffolding, ropes, copper chisels, and heavy stone mallets. They have a list, a job to do. Their work was systematic, it was precise, and it was total. They began with the statues. Hundreds of statues of Hatshepsut in her full pharaonic regalia lined the terraces and chambers of her temple. They were images of her as a sphinx, images of her standing in the pose of Osiris, images of her sitting as a king on his throne. They toppled them. They dragged them out and they began the killing. As we learned, to the Egyptians, a statue was a body for the Ka, the spirit. To destroy the statue, you had to kill it. The workers struck the faces. They broke the noses to stop the Ka from breathing. They smashed the mouths to stop the Ka from speaking the magic words of the afterlife. They smashed the ears so the Ka could no longer hear its name being spoken. This was not vandalism. This was a ritual, an execution. But the most fascinating part is, they buried the pieces. They didn't grind them to dust. They didn't reuse them as rubble. They gathered the thousands and thousands of broken fragments and they buried them in a large pit right there near the temple. This pit, which we now call the Hatshepsut Hole, is one of the strangest parts of the story. Was it a sign of lingering respect? A refusal to defile the sacred images even in their dead state? Or was it just the easiest way to dispose of them? We will never know, but this act of burial is the very reason we have them. In 1903, an American archaeologist named Herbert Winlock, digging at Deir el-Bakhri, found this pit. He found a graveyard of statues, thousands of pieces of red granite and white limestone. It was, as he put it, like finding a divine jigsaw puzzle. It would take decades, but by piecing them together, we were able to see the face and form of the king who was meant to be invisible. The act of burial, intended to hide her, is what ultimately preserved her. The statues were only the beginning. The workers then turned to the walls.
Everywhere she was depicted as king, her image had to go. The tap, tap, tap of the chisels would have echoed through those temple halls for years. The workers would scrape and hammer at the delicate reliefs.
They chiseled away her face, her body, her cartouche, the oval that held her royal name. They left a rough, blank scar, a Hatshepsut-shaped hole in the timeline. They were incredibly thorough. They went to Karnak Temple. Her two 100-foot-tall obelisks were too big to tear down, so Thutmose III tried to wall them up. He ordered a giant wall of sandstone to be built around them to hide them from view. It was like trying to build a box around a skyscraper. He almost succeeded, but his wall wasn't tall enough. The very tops of her obelisks, the golden-plated tips, still peeked over the top, catching the sun. But the most telling detail is what they didn't erase. In a few hard-to-reach places, or in parts of the temple dedicated to her life before she was king, they left her image alone. In some reliefs, she is shown as the great royal wife, the queen. They left that. In others, she is shown as a princess. They left that. They were not trying to erase Hatshepsut, the woman. They were trying to erase King Hatshepsut, the pharaoh. This was not a personal attack. This was a political and spiritual redaction. Which brings us at last to the great central question: why? If it wasn't personal hatred, why, after 20 years of peace, would Thutmose III go to such extraordinary, expensive, and difficult lengths to erase her predecessor? The academic consensus, the story told by the evidence, points to two intertwined possibilities. The first is the concept of Ma'at. We have spoken of this before. Ma'at was the divine, correct order of the universe. It was truth, balance, and harmony. The sun rose because of Ma'at. The Nile flooded because of Ma'at. And Ma'at dictated that the king was a man. A pharaoh was the strong bull. He was the Horus, the male god on earth. Hatshepsut, by ruling as a female king, had been a magnificent, successful anomaly. She was a break in the pattern. She was a cosmic irregularity. Thutmose III, as an old king, may have looked back on his life and felt a deep, pious duty to fix the timeline, to restore Ma'at, to smooth out this bump in the history books. By erasing her kingship, he was not saying she was bad. He was saying this did not happen. He was correcting the divine record to ensure the gods were at peace and the universe remained in balance. It was not personal. It was cosmic paperwork. But there is a second theory, one that is more human and perhaps more powerful. It has to do with his own son. After 20 years, Thutmose III was an old man. His greatest concern was no longer his own legacy, but the legacy of his heir. He had a son, the prince, who would one day become Amenhotep II. Thutmose III had to ensure a smooth, clean, and undisputed succession. Now, think. Thutmose III knew better than anyone what it was like to be a junior king. He knew what it was like to be overshadowed by a powerful royal woman. He looked at the precedent Hatshepsut had set, and it must have terrified him. What if, after he died, his own wife or another powerful woman in the court decided to do what Hatshepsut had done? What if his son Amenhotep II was forced into a co-regency? Hatshepsut's glorious 22-year reign had created a precedent. It showed it could be done. Thutmose III could not let that precedent stand. He had to break it. He had to make it so that no one, ever again, could point to the walls of Deir el-Bahri and say, "Look, a woman can be king. It has been done." So he ordered the chisels. He was not erasing the past. He was trying to control the future. He was closing a door and locking it. He was ensuring that the line of pharaohs would be male forever. The great erasure of Hatshepsut was not an act of revenge. It was a cold, brutal and systematic act of political engineering designed to secure the line of succession for his son. But, as we stand here today, speaking her name, we know it did not work. The blank spaces, the chiseled-out scars, the broken statues buried in the sand, they did not create silence. They created a mystery. They became the clues that forced us to ask, who was here? Who was so important that they had to be forgotten? The erasers, in their attempt to destroy her, gave her a different kind of immortality. They made her perhaps the most famous woman in all of ancient Egypt. We watched as the memory of King Hatshepsut was chiseled from the walls of her own temples. It was a cold, calculated act, done decades after her death. It was not, we learned, an act of personal hatred, but one of politics. It was the pharaoh Thutmose III trying to correct the timeline, to restore the divine order, the Ma'at, that said a king must be a man. He did it to protect the line of succession for his son. It was a political act. Tonight we move forward in time, but we remain in the same powerful 18th dynasty. We are about to witness another erasure, a condemnation of memory. But this one was not for politics. This one was for religion. This is the story of a pharaoh who did not just break a rule. He tried to set fire to the entire 1,500-year-old rule book. He tried to tear down the very gods of Egypt. And for this, the state would not just erase him, it would curse him. It would label him the enemy and the criminal. This is the strange, unsettling, and revolutionary story of Akhenaten. Our story begins in a time of perfection. We are in the reign of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, who ruled around 1390 BC. He was the great-grandson of Thutmose III. His reign was the absolute, glittering peak of the new kingdom. Egypt was, quite simply, the richest and most powerful nation on earth. Gold flooded in from the south. Tribute came from the east. The empire was stable. There was no need for war. Amenhotep III was not a warrior. He was a builder. He called himself the Magnificent. He built the vast, beautiful Luxor temple. He built a mortuary temple so large that the only thing remaining of it today are two giant statues, the Colossi of Memnon. The art of his time was a perfection of the classic style. It was elegant, serene, and godlike. The religion was stable. The king of the gods, Amun-Ra, reigned supreme from his great temple complex at Karnak, in the capital city of Thebes. The priesthood of Amun was second in power only to the pharaoh himself. They controlled a vast portion of Egypt's land and wealth. They were, in effect, a state within a state. Everything was in its right place. The Ma'at was in balance. Into this world of gold, stability, and unshakable tradition, a new pharaoh was born. When Amenhotep III died, his son took the throne. He was crowned, as was tradition, in the great capital city of Thebes, and he took the traditional royal name of Amenhotep IV. Let us pause on that name, Amenhotep. It means Amun is satisfied. His very name was a public declaration of his loyalty to the great god Amun, to the capital of Thebes, and to the all-powerful priesthood. For the first few years of his reign, everything seemed normal. He added to the great temple at Karnak. He ruled his empire. He was a traditional pharaoh in a traditional time. And then, in about the 5th year of his reign, he changed. We do not know why. This is the great central mystery. There is no document, no letter, no inscription that tells us why. Was it a profound personal spiritual revelation, a vision? Or was it a cold, calculated politics, a plan to break the suffocating power of the Amun priesthood, the only group who could challenge him? We will never know the why. We can only watch what he did. And what he did was to turn all of Egypt upside down. His revolution began with a single god. He did not invent this god. It was an old minor deity, a small aspect of the great sun god, Ra. It was called the Aten. The Aten was not a man with a hawk's head like Ra. It was not a hidden, mysterious force like Amun. It was quite simply the physical, visible disk of the sun itself, the blazing, life-giving sun. In the early years, Amenhotep IV simply promoted this god. He built a small temple to the Aten right next to the great temple of Amun. It was a challenge. And then the revolution began in earnest. First, he changed his name. This was his point of no return. He cast off the name he was born with. He was no longer Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. He declared his new name was Akhenaten, he who is effective for the Aten. It was a declaration of war. He was no longer the servant of Amun. He was the servant of the Aten. His next act was unthinkable. He abandoned Thebes. He abandoned the 1,000-year-old capital of Egypt. He abandoned the great temples of his fathers. He abandoned the sacred burial ground, the Valley of the Kings. He turned his back on it all, and he took his wife, the beautiful Nefertiti, his children, and his entire royal court, and he marched them out into the middle of the desert. He found a patch of nothing, a stretch of empty virgin sand bordered by cliffs. And here, he said, we will build a new city, a pure city, a city for our God. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. We call this city Amarna. He built it with a speed that is baffling. In just a few years, a massive, sprawling city rose from the sand. Palaces, temples, great wide roads, tombs for his nobles, and it was all dedicated to the Aten. The temples were revolutionary. The old temples, like Karnak, were dark, heavy, mysterious places. You would walk from a bright courtyard into a shadowy hall, into a small pitch-black room where the god's statue was hidden. The temples of the Aten had no roofs. They were vast, open-air courtyards, completely open to the sky, open to the sun. There were no dark corners. There were no hidden statues. The god was right there shining down on you.
And in this new city, Akhenaten's religion crystallized. He was no longer just promoting the Aten. He was canceling everyone else. Akhenaten declared that the Aten was not just the chief god, it was the only god. All the others, Amun, Osiris, Isis, Thoth, Hathor, all the gods your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had worshipped for 1,000 years, they were false. They were idols. They were lies. This was the great heresy. In one stroke, he made Egypt monotheistic. He erased the entire pantheon of gods, and he made himself the center. Akhenaten taught that no one could understand the Aten except for him. You, the common person, could no longer pray to Osiris to protect you in the afterlife. You could no longer pray to Isis for magic and healing. Instead, you had to pray to Akhenaten. You would worship the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh would speak to his father, the Aten. He and Nefertiti were the only priests, the only bridge to the divine. This was not just a religious change, this was a power change. He had not just broken the Amun priesthood, he had made them obsolete. And then came the attack. It was not enough to just ignore the old gods. They had to be erased.
just as Thutmose III had sent workers to erase Hatshepsut. Akhenaten sent his workers to erase the gods. He ordered his men to go into the temples, the tombs, the monuments, all across Egypt, and to find the name of Amun-Ra, and to chisel it out. It was a terrifying, systematic campaign. They even chiseled the name of Amun out of the cartouches of his own father, Amenhotep III. They went after the plural word, gods. Anywhere an inscription said, the gods, they were ordered to hack that word gods out, leaving a blank, silent scar. It was an act of iconoclasm, a violent destruction of belief. A new, strange religion required a new, strange art. And the art of this period, the Amarna art, is perhaps the most shocking part of his revolution. For 1,500 years, Egyptian art was rigid. It was not meant to be realistic. It was meant to be perfect. The pharaoh was always young. He was always strong. He was always muscular, with broad shoulders and a narrow waist. He was an ideal, a symbol of power and mod. Akhenaten threw this all away. He ordered his artists to show him as he was, or perhaps as he wanted to be seen, in his new divine form. The Amarna style is unsettling. He is shown with a long, thin, drooping face, a long, skinny neck, high, slanted, almond-shaped eyes, thick, almost sensual lips. His body is unlike any pharaoh before. He has a narrow, rounded chest, a thin, weak-looking upper body, and then a soft, sagging, drooping belly, and wide, almost feminine hips and thighs. For decades, historians and doctors have tried to diagnose him. Did he have a genetic disorder? Marfan syndrome? Froelich syndrome? But many historians today believe this was not realism. It was theology. Perhaps Akhenaten was trying to say, I am everything. In his new religion, the Aten was the only creator, the mother and father of all. Perhaps Akhenaten was having himself depicted as androgynous, as both male and female, the living embodiment of the all-encompassing creator God on earth. This new art also showed things never seen before. It showed intimacy. We have reliefs of Akhenaten kissing Nefertiti. We see him playing with his daughters, holding them on his knee, letting them pull at his royal robes. We see the royal family grieving. We see them weeping over the body of one of their daughters who died. This is revolutionary. Before this, the pharaoh was a god, a symbol. Akhenaten, for the first time, showed the pharaoh as a person, a father, a husband. It is a strange, unsettling mix of abstract divinity and very raw humanity. This strange, intense revolution lasted for 17 years. It was the entire length of his reign, and it is very likely that the people of Egypt hated it. The common people were cut off from their gods. Osiris, the god who promised them an afterlife, was gone. Isis, the goddess who protected them, was gone. They were left with a cold, distant, intellectual god, the Aten, who they could not even pray to, and the empire began to fray. We have proof of this. In the ruins of Amarna, archaeologists found a stash of clay tablets. They are written in cuneiform, the language of international diplomacy. They are letters to Akhenaten from the kings and vassals of the Near East. We call them the Amarna letters, and they tell a desperate story. They are from allied kings begging for help. They say, our lands are being attacked. Send us soldiers. Send us gold. And again, they complain, we have written to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh does not answer. While the empire his grandfathers had built at the edges was crumbling, Akhenaten was busy composing hymns to the sun. Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign, and his revolution died with him. It evaporated, as if it had never been. After his death there was chaos. A mysterious ruler or two reigned for a very short time. Perhaps Nefertiti herself tried to rule. We are not sure. But we know that within a few years, a young boy was placed on the throne. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. He was almost certainly Akhenaten's son. He was a child, and the old powers, the priests, the generals, the old families who had survived the revolution rushed in to fill the vacuum. They took control of the boy king, and they undid everything. They forced the boy to make a great public declaration. He abandoned Akhenaten's city. He and the entire court left Amarna, and the sands blew in to cover its streets. They moved back to Thebes. And the boy king, in his final symbolic act of surrender, changed his name. He was no longer Tutankhaten. He became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The old gods had won. The restoration was complete. But for the men who now ruled Egypt, it was not just enough to return. The stain of the heretic king had to be scoured. The memory of Akhenaten had to be annihilated. And that great second erasure, that of the enemy himself, is the story we will tell next.
We watched a pharaoh, Akhenaten, turn his back on 1,000 years of faith. He abandoned the gods of his fathers. He built a new city in the desert, a city he called Akhenaten. He created a new art, a new, strange, and unsettling reality. He ruled for 17 years, an eye blink in the long story of Egypt. And then he died. His revolution did not outlive him. It evaporated. It was a strange, intense, and brilliant fever. And in the years that followed his death, the fever broke. What comes after a revolution? What comes after the isfet, the chaos? A desperate, aching need to restore Maat, the divine order. Tonight, we are not watching a new idea being born. We are watching one being buried. This is the story of the great undoing, the story of how Egypt wiped the slate clean. The immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's death, around 1336 BC, is a blur. The timeline is murky. A mysterious pharaoh, or perhaps two, ruled for a few fleeting years. We see a name, Smenkhkare. We are not sure who he was. We see hints that perhaps Akhenaten's wife, the beautiful Nefertiti, may have even tried to rule in her own right. It was a time of chaos. The experiment had failed, and out of this chaos, the old powers, the powers that Akhenaten had tried to destroy, began to move. The generals of the army, the old powerful priests, the traditional noble families. They had waited, they had survived, and they saw their chance. They needed a new pharaoh, a new legitimate pharaoh. And they found one, a boy. He was perhaps 9 years old. He was almost certainly Akhenaten's own son. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. He was a child, the last living link to the heretic king, and he was a perfect puppet. The men who now ruled through this boy, the high official Ai and the great general Horemheb, knew that to save Egypt, to restore Maat, they had to undo everything. The undoing began with two symbolic acts. First, the name. The boy king was forced to repudiate his father's god. He changed his name.
It was the most public and most profound act of surrender. He was no longer Tutankhaten. He became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. Amun, the god who had been erased, was now back. He was back in the pharaoh's own name. The restoration had begun. Second, the city. The royal court abandoned Akhenaten. They left the open-air temples. They left the wide, sun-drenched avenues. They left the palaces and the tombs in the cliffs. They left it to the sand, to the wind. It was a failed utopia. And the entire government, the scribes, the priests, the artists, the pharaoh, they packed up and they walked away. They moved back to the old capitals, back to Memphis, the administrative center, and back to Thebes, the religious heart of the land, back to the home of the god Amun. The young king, Tutankhamun, soon issued a public decree, a proclamation. We call it the Restoration Stela. It is, without a doubt, one of the most important documents in all of Egyptian history, because it is the official narrative of the counter-revolution. It is propaganda, of course, but it tells us, in the official language of the state, why the Amarna period had to die. The stela describes Egypt before Tutankhamun. It describes the land as Akhenaten had left it, and the language is desperate. It says, "The land was in sickness. When His Majesty appeared as king, the temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine down to the delta had fallen into ruin. Their shrines had become desolate. They had crumbled into mounds overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been." It is a portrait of total cosmic collapse, and it says the gods had abandoned Egypt. If one prayed to a god to ask a thing of him, he would not come. If one made supplication to a goddess, she would not come. Their hearts were weak in their bodies. They had destroyed that which had been made. This is Isfet. This is chaos. The heretic king had broken Maat. He had broken the world. And then the stela tells us the young king, Tutankhamun, saved it. He is described as the savior, the son of Amun, who put Maat in the place of the lie. The stela says he rebuilt the temples. He recarved the statues of the gods in gold and lapis lazuli. He reestablished the priesthoods and filled their storerooms with offerings. He pacified the angry, absent gods, and he brought them home. It was a total and complete reversal. The slate was being wiped. Tutankhamun did not see the restoration completed. He ruled for perhaps 10 years. He died suddenly, around the age of 19. His sudden death and his hurried burial in a small, borrowed tomb is the very reason his treasures were preserved for us. He was, in the end, just a transitional figure. He was followed by the old official Ai, who had also served Akhenaten. Ai ruled for just 4 years. The 18th dynasty, the great golden family of Thutmose, of Hatshepsut, of Amenhotep the Magnificent, and of Akhenaten. It died with Ai. The line was broken. And now the true erasure could begin.
The man who took the throne was not a royal. He was the man who had been waiting in the shadows all along. He was Horemheb, the great general. He had served under Akhenaten. He had served under Tutankhamun. And now he was Pharaoh. He came to the throne around 1319 BC. Horemheb had a problem. He had no royal blood. He had no claim to the throne. He needed to legitimize himself, and he did this by becoming the ultimate restorer. He would be the pharaoh who healed Egypt. And to do that, he had to surgically remove the sickness.
He had to erase not just Akhenaten, but the entire chaotic Amarna period. Tutankhamun and I had started the restoration. Horemheb would finish it, with a hammer. Horemheb's Damnatio Memoriae was thorough, it was brutal, and it was efficient. He turned on Akhenaten with a fury the state had never seen. He issued edicts. He declared the worship of the Aten to be illegal. He ordered the dismantling of Akhenaten's entire city. Akhenaten, Amarna, was torn down. It was declared a quarry. Its beautiful palaces, its temples, were broken up, and the stone was carted away to be used in new buildings. But his most symbolic act of destruction happened at Karnak. Akhenaten, in his early zealous years, had built his own temples to the Aten right next to the great temple of Amun. Horemheb gave the order, tear them down. His workers dismantled Akhenaten's temples, block by block. Akhenaten had famously used small, standardized stone blocks that a single man could carry. We call them talatat. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and Horemheb's workers used them as rubble. Horemheb was building new, massive gateways or pylons at Karnak to honor Amun, and his men took the talatat, the tens of thousands of painted, carved blocks from Akhenaten's heretical temples, and they dumped them inside his new pylons, as filler. It is the perfect metaphor. He was literally building his own legacy, his traditional pious legacy, on top of the buried, hidden, crushed remains of the heretic. It was not enough to forget Akhenaten. His memory had to actively be desecrated. The name Akhenaten was chiseled from every surface in Egypt that had not already been destroyed. His strange statues were smashed. He was no longer a pharaoh. In the official records, he was referred to only as the enemy, or the criminal of Akhenaten. The slate was almost clean. But Horemheb had one final act of bureaucratic genius. He had to fix the timeline. He himself was not royal, so he linked himself to the last pure, legitimate king, the last pharaoh who ruled before the chaos, Amenhotep III, the Magnificent. Horemheb decreed that his reign was the direct succession of Amenhotep III. He dated his own rule retroactively to before Akhenaten, as if he had always been the rightful king. This policy was cemented by the pharaohs who followed. The great Seti I of the new 19th dynasty carved a new official king list at his temple in Abydos. It is a holy record, a list of all the legitimate kings of Egypt who came before him, a chronological hall of fame. On that wall we see the name of Amenhotep III, and the next name on the list is Horemheb. In one single clean carved line of stone, the entire Amarna period was gone. Akhenaten never existed. The mysterious Smenkhare never existed. Tutankhamun, the famous King Tut, never existed. The old official eye never existed. They were all erased. They were all tainted. They were part of the chaos. The sickness had been cured, the stain had been scrubbed, the motte was restored, the slate was finally clean. For 3,000 years, the story ended there. Akhenaten was forgotten. Until one day, in the late 19th century, a peasant woman digging in the ruins of his forgotten city found a collection of strange clay tablets, the clues that the erasers had missed.
In our story so far, we have witnessed the crime. We watched as the memory of a great king, Hatshepsut, was chiseled from her own walls, an act of cold political calculation. We then watched as the memory of a heretic, Akhenaten, was not just chiseled, but pulverized, his city torn down, his name cursed, his entire era plucked from the timeline. We have seen the erasure, the great cleaning of the slate. And so, we arrive at the great silence. For 3,000 years, the erasers won. The names Hatshepsut and Akhenaten were gone. They were silent. History was what the victors said it was. The official king lists at Abydos and at Saqqara were clean. The timeline was pure. The Isfet,
The chaos had been corrected. The Ma'at was restored. For 1,000 years, Egypt forgot them. For 2,000 years, the Roman and Greek worlds who looked upon the pyramids never knew their names. For 3,000 years, the world did not know they had existed. The erasure was complete. It worked. Until it didn't. Tonight, our chapter is not about the erasers. It is about the finders. It is the story of how we know. How, after 3 millennia of perfect silence, we began to hear the whispers that remained. The first whisper was not a name, it was a voice. Before we could find the lost pharaohs, we had to learn to listen. For 1,500 years, the language of ancient Egypt was dead. The beautiful hieroglyphics that covered every temple and every tomb were mute. They were not a language. People thought they were magic symbols, dark spells, strange pictures that held no sound. The stones could not speak. And then, in 1799, some French soldiers working for Napoleon were rebuilding a fort in a town called Rosetta. They found a stone, a broken black slab. It was not impressive, but it was everything, because it held one message written in 3 scripts. At the bottom was ancient Greek, a language we could read. In the middle was Demotic, a cursive Egyptian script, and at the top were the sacred hieroglyphs. This was the key, the legend on a map. It took 20 years of brilliant minds obsessing over this stone, and then a young French scholar, Jean-François Champollion, had the breakthrough. In 1822, he cracked the code. He proved that hieroglyphs were not just pictures, they were sounds. They were an alphabet. They were a language. For the first time in 1.5 millennia, Egypt could speak. The silence was broken, and now the detective work could begin. The first mystery was at Thebes. Now that Egyptologists could read, they began recording the king lists, and they read the histories carved by the pharaohs themselves. And a name was missing. The name Hatshepsut was nowhere. But when these early scholars came to this magnificent temple, Djeser Djeseru, Dir el-Bahri, they found confusion. They read the hieroglyphs, and the temple said it was built by a ruler named Hatshepsut. They saw images of Thutmose I, they saw Thutmose II, and Thutmose III. But underneath those names, they sometimes saw the faint outline of another name, the name Hatshepsut. And they saw the images. They saw images of a king in a kilt and a beard, but the inscriptions next to him used female grammar. It was baffling. They theorized that Hatshepsut was just a loyal queen building a temple for her father. They could not imagine the truth. The erasers had done their job so well that even when staring at the evidence, the scholars could not see it. The whisper was too faint.
The truth came out not from the wall, but from the ground. In the 1920s, an American archaeologist from the Metropolitan Museum of Art named Herbert Winlock was excavating in the sand in front of Hatshepsut's temple. He was not looking for anything special. He was just clearing the debris, and his workers found a pit, a hole that had been dug in antiquity. And inside this pit was a nightmare. Thousands of broken pieces of stone. It was chaos, a jumble of smashed statues. But Winlock looked closer. He saw a hand, a knee, a piece of a false beard, a fragment of an eye. And he realized what he was looking at. This was not rubbish. This was the graveyard. This was the evidence pile. This was Hatshepsut. The erasers working for Thutmose III had smashed her hundreds of statues. They had ritually killed them, and then they had buried the bodies. They hid the evidence, and in doing so, they preserved it. They created a time capsule.
For years, Winlock and his team played the world's greatest jigsaw puzzle. They patiently sorted thousands of fragments, and slowly, out of the dust and the chaos, she reappeared. The statues were rebuilt, and now all the other clues made sense. The scars on the wall, the confusing grammar, the chiseled-out names.
The truth came out, not from the wall, but from the ground. In the 1920s, an American archaeologist from the Metropolitan Museum of Art named Herbert Winlock was excavating in the sand in front of Hatshepsut's temple. He was not looking for anything special, he was just clearing the debris, and his workers found a pit, a hole that had been dug in antiquity, and inside this pit was a nightmare. Thousands of broken pieces of stone. It was chaos, a jumble of smashed statues. But Winlock looked closer. He saw a hand, a knee, a piece of a false beard, a fragment of an eye, and he realized what he was looking at. This was not rubbish. This was the graveyard. This was the evidence pile. This was Hatshepsut. The erasers working for Thutmose III had smashed her hundreds of statues. They had ritually killed them, and then they had buried the bodies. They hid the evidence, and in doing so, they preserved it. They created a time capsule. For years, Winlock and his team played the world's greatest jigsaw puzzle. They patiently sorted thousands of fragments, and slowly, out of the dust and the chaos, she reappeared. The statues were rebuilt, and now all the other clues made sense. The scars on the wall, the confusing grammar, the chiseled-out names. This was the whisper. Hatshepsut was not missing, she was hiding in plain sight. The scars were the map, the erasure was the clue. She was found not in spite of the erasure, but because of it. The rediscovery of Akhenaten was even stranger. His erasure was more complete. The king lists jumped right over him. From Amenhotep III to Horemheb, the gap was seamless. His city, Akhenaten, was gone, wiped from the map. There was no Hatshepsut hole full of statues. There was nothing. The whisper here came from a place no one expected. It came from the ruins of his lost city, which the locals called Tel El Amarna. In 1887, long before archaeologists knew what this place was, a local woman digging in the ruins for fertilizer found some strange clay tablets. They were not beautiful. They looked like dried mud, and they were covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks. This was not hieroglyphs. It was cuneiform, the language of Mesopotamia, the language of international diplomacy. These tablets were letters. They were the royal archive of the pharaoh. They were desperate messages from the kings of Syria and Babylon and Cyprus to the pharaoh of Egypt. They complained. They begged. They asked why the pharaoh had stopped answering his mail. And they named him. And they named his city, Akhenaten. Suddenly, the gap in the timeline had a name. The Amarna letters proved that here, in this empty patch of desert, a great king had ruled. A king who Egypt had tried to forget. The second whisper of Akhenaten was even more ironic. Remember Horemheb and Ramses, the great restorers? They tore down Akhenaten's temples at Karnak. They broke them up into tens of thousands of small blocks, the talatat. And they used this rubble as filler. They hid the heresy inside the walls of their own new pious buildings. They thought they had destroyed them. Instead, they preserved them. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to study these new buildings, and they realized what was inside. They realized that Horemheb's giant pylons were stuffed full of Akhenaten's lost temples, a giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Today, we use computers. We scan every single talatat block, and digitally, we are rebuilding the lost temples of the Aten. Horemheb, in his fury to erase, accidentally created the time capsule that allowed us to see the world he tried to destroy. A whisper is a powerful thing.
it survives. The erasers failed. They thought history was written in stone, but they forgot that stone remembers. They forgot that every act of destruction leaves a mark, a chiseled-out scar, a pit full of broken statues, a letter buried in the sand, a hidden block inside a wall. The whispers remained, waiting in the dust, waiting for thousands of years, waiting for us, for someone patient enough to stop and to listen.
Our journey through the shadows of the past is now at its end. We began by searching not for the monuments we all know, but for the gaps, the blank spaces, the scars chiseled into the stone. We were listening for the silence. In that silence, we found two of the loudest stories in all of ancient history. We found Hatshepsut, the king who was a queen, a woman of immense power and ambition who built an empire of peace and art. And we watched as her memory was systematically removed, not in a fit of rage, but in a cold, calculated act of politics, decades after her death. Her stepson, Thutmose III, needed to secure his own son's future. He needed to restore Ma'at, the divine order that said a king must be a man. And then we found Akhenaten, the heretic king, the revolutionary who tried to remake his world in the image of a single god, the Aten. And we watched as the pharaohs who came after, Horemheb and Ramesses, tore his city down and cursed his name, declaring him the enemy. They were not just restoring politics, they were healing a spiritual wound. They were erasing a blasphemy. The men who ordered these erasures believed they were victorious. They believed they had fixed the timeline. They believed they had wiped the slate clean. And for 3,000 years, they were right. The world forgot. But as we learned, history is not a slate. It is stone. And you cannot erase a carving in stone without leaving a mark, a scar. The erasers failed. In their furious attempt to create silence, they only created a mystery. And we human beings are drawn to mystery. They gave us the clues, the chisel marks, the gaps in the king lists, the Amarna letters buried in the sand of a forgotten city, the thousands of smashed statues of Hatshepsut hidden in a pit like a broken puzzle waiting for us to solve, the tens of thousands of Talatat blocks from Akhenaten's temples used as rubble, accidentally preserving his revolution inside his enemy's walls. The erasers, in their piety and their politics, unintentionally gave their victims a new immortality. Hatshepsut and Akhenaten were denied the eternity they wanted, but they were given one they never could have imagined. They are not just names in a long list of kings. They are stories. They are mysteries. They are the whispers that remained. The sands of Egypt never truly forget. They just wait. Thank you for joining us on Sleeping History. Until next time, rest well and dream of history.